Well, thank you very much for joining us today. This is another one of our webinars of the International Geraniaceae Group. My name is Matthias Strlic, and I'll be talking about the pelargoniums and other Geraniaceae as well that can be found at the extreme southwestern end of the Namib Desert, around, but also in Luderitz, as we can see on the photo in the screen, which shows the Felsenkirche and some particularly nice shrubs of Pelargonium Cortusifolium just next to the church. There's a lot of development going on in this area, and the first time I visited this area in 2003, there used to be many more of these shrublets. However, a couple of years ago in 2018, when with my partner Andre, we visited the area last time, we were only able to find perhaps 3 or 4 shrubs, but there are of course many more growing around the town of Luderitz. So let's have a look at the area that we're going to discuss and try and explore a little bit more today. Luderitz lies in the southwest of Namibia, at the southwestern border of the Namib Desert, which is where the dunes meet rocky slopes and rocky inselbergs of the southern Namib and of the northern diamond mining area. This area used to be restricted for anyone who wasn't involved in the mining business, but can now be visited by tourists as well, although it can only be visited from the town of Luderitz and only if accompanied by tour guides. So it's not an area that can be freely visited by anyone, but at least it can be visited these days. This is also the northwestern border of the winter rainfall area, which extends from about the town of Luderitz all the way down via the Richtersveld, the Namaqualand proper towards Cape Town, and then of course the Overberg towards Port Elizabeth. So this is the area of Southern Africa, of the Southern African continent, where the majority of rain falls in the winter, but it's also a particularly dry area, and nowhere more so than in the Namib Desert. We're going to explore particularly the peninsula south of Luderitz, which is a national park and can be freely visited. It's an exceptionally beautiful area, and for any plant lover visiting Namibia, this is the place to go. There are also a couple of places just north of Luderitz that can be visited by tourists. And I should also say that the majority of these inselbergs, the majority of these small mountains are particularly interesting. And although they are not on anyone's tourist itinerary, except for some of us who are particularly interested in desert plants, these are really not visited very often, and also the roads in this area are particularly bad. This is an area that receives very, very little rainfall. As you can see, in May, the town of Luderitz receives only about 5 millimeters of rain. So across the year, it might get anywhere between 20 to 40 millimeters of rain, 30 millimeters in an average year. The temperatures are mild because of the Atlantic Ocean. In the winter, so in the months of June, July, August, the typical temperatures are about 15 degrees, and in the summer only about 20, 22 degrees. So there is not a lot of variation in the temperature between the summer and the winter. This is because of the buffering effect of the Atlantic Ocean. And I should also say that the ocean is particularly cold. at this part of the continent because this is the ocean that extends or that runs from the pole towards along the western coast of the South African continent and up towards the tropical Africa. The ocean typically has about 15, 17 degrees, so it cools down the immediate area, the immediate coast. But of course, towards inland, the climate becomes even more extreme. So hotter temperatures in the summer and cooler temperatures in the winter, and also obviously hotter temperatures during the day and cooler temperatures during the night, and of course, less rain as well. It should also be said that there is a lot of, not so much rain, but a lot of fog that complements the meager rainfall. So a lot of the plants in this area have evolved very dense, are very densely hairy, so that they can extract the water through fog that complements the very, very few millimeters of rainfall that these plants typically get. Luderitz is a very peculiar town. It is a town that served the miners, but it's also a town that still retains a lot of its original German culture. I mean, by original, I mean pre-Second World War. Obviously, Namibia, or Southwest Africa, as it used to be called, was colonized by Germany and later on by South Africa. And a lot of German-speaking population still exists, particularly in and around Luderitz. And if looking for a proper beer and a proper sausage, this is where you will get it in Namibia. However, we're not here to talk about beer and sausages. We're here to talk about Uraniaceae. So let's take the road south and visit the Luderitz Peninsula straight away. This is what the peninsula would look like from the ocean, if looking at it from the ocean on a typical winter day. Dense fogs rolling over the peninsula for the majority of the day, and as already discussed, complementing the few millimeters of rainfall. However, of course, there are particularly sunny days as well, obviously, but what I also wanted to mention is that that most of the days, the peninsula would be swept by extremely high winds. And we'll see that those winds have led to plants developing particularly thick stems, either to withstand the winds, or they have developed stems that are almost horizontal in growth. And we'll see at some Munsonias, section Sarcocolum, that grow almost horizontally because of those high winds, whereas in other areas, they grow vertically. And we'll look at some particularly striking examples of that type of growth. As we drive towards the peninsula, anywhere on the slopes, we see particularly striking examples of Pelargonium Serotophilum. So that's a section Cortusina plant. We see that it has particularly thick stems. It has very thick succulent leaves that are microscopically hairy, so they almost appear, a little bit whitish. And they have particularly nice star-shaped flowers. What's typical for these flowers is that they are borne on reddish or almost dark red peduncles, which to my mind are quite typical for the species. This is perhaps not a very young specimen, but it's definitely a specimen that has very thick stems. There are two sister species that look very, very similar, Pelargonium Serotophilum as well as Pelargonium albersi. And this second species was described maybe about 15 years ago by Matthias Becker. And this Pelargonium albersi, we'll see a specimen of that a little bit later, has very similar leaves, very similar flowers. However, it has flowers that have a lemony scent, in contrast to Pelargonium Serotophilum that doesn't have a scent, or the flowers of which don't smell. The other important difference is that Pelargonium Serotophilum doesn't have tubers, whereas Pelargonium albersi does. So this is a smallish plant. There are a number of very large plants as well that grow in slightly sheltered conditions. This must be a fairly old plant covered with leaves, of course, and also with flowers. This was in late August, so the plant was at the beginning of the flowering period. Moving further south, we saw lots of flowering plants. These are the typical Otivia type flowers. We see that the flowers they have the typical ears. The flowers that the posterior petals of Otivia flowers have ears, which is how we recognize that this is a section Otivia plant. And we see the leaves that have those microscopic hairs that make them appear almost white. There's all sorts of wildlife here, and some of that wildlife also tends to eat pelargoniums, and some of those bugs also appear to attack pelargonium flowers, and we see a caterpillar munching on petals. However, this photograph is also interesting because we see the intensely red color of hypanthea, of pedicels, and of peduncles, which I believe is quite typical for this species as well. Other species in the section Otivia don't have these particularly dark red colored pedicels, peduncles, and hypanthea. Another absolutely striking species that is very common on the Luderitz Peninsula is Pelargonium crassicaule. Like Pelargonium cortusifolium, this is also section Cortusina. It can have flowers of very different colors, from white to pink and dark pink. And it's also interesting that, like Pelargonium cortusifolium, it often has the upper two petals, the posterior petals, that are slightly differently colored to the anterior petals. Just a slightly different shade of pink or different shade of red. And in UV, those petals appear extremely different. The upper petals look almost black, and the anterior petals look much fairer, much lighter in color. What's absolutely stunning about Pelargonium crassicaule on the Luderitz Peninsula is that it has extremely thick stems that appear superficially very similar to many sarcocaulons that we also grow and that we will find on this peninsula as well. And they appear to be waxy. We'll see that the thickness of stems depends very much on where the species grows, whether we look at it on the peninsula, north of Luderitz, or inland, and we'll compare not just the shape of these shrublets, but also the thickness and the branching patterns of these shrublets in a few minutes. The stems and the branching pattern here is very, very different to the thickness of stems and the branching patterns north of Luderitz. And it is, again, extremely different to what we seem to believe is a different species, Pelargonium mirabile or Pelargonium Mirandas, as Richard Clifton renamed it. And we'll see and discuss those differences a little bit later. One of those differences is, or is purported to be, that Pelargonium crassicaule never develops tubers, whereas Pelargonium mirabile or Pelargonium Mirandas does. I took the liberty and uncovered or uprooted a small seedling of Pelargonium crassicaule, and you can see that it doesn't indeed have any tubers at all. Although I tried really hard and uncover all the roots to their tips. There is no evidence of any thickening, so it might actually be the case that Pelargonium crassicaule is different to Pelargonium Mirandus, not just because of its stem thickness, but also because of the absence of tubers. I obviously planted this plant, replanted the plant, so hopefully it still grows successfully. But I was also able to collect some seeds of this species in the wild, and I share those seeds with some colleagues who have successfully germinated them in the Mediterranean climate. And I'm looking forward to them reporting whether those seedlings develop tubers or not. Whether tubers are an important characteristic of plants of pelargoniums is debatable, I think. We know that Pelargonium alternans, for example, should never develop tubers, and yet we know that there is at least one population of Pelargonium alternans with tubers in the Klein Karoo. So presence and absence of tubers may be a local adaptation rather than a species character. Another absolutely stunning taxon is, of course, Pelargonium Cortusifolium. I just cannot describe how beautiful these specimens were at the southern tip of the Luderitz Peninsula. These must be so old, and these must be growing in particularly adverse conditions, but these also must be experiencing a lot of aerial humidity, because the stems of these specimens were almost completely covered with lichens. This is a specimen that was almost impossible to tell apart from the surrounding rock, because the lichens were growing, the same type of lichen was growing on the rocks and on the stems, and these are just absolutely magnificent. At least in this specimen, we can still see what the stems are. There were specimens where it was almost impossible to tell where the rock starts and the stem ends. And this was another particularly stunning specimen. Even the lichens themselves are colorful and interesting to look at. And here's a particularly nice example of Pelargonium Cortusifolium with a yellow lichen growing all over it.
But yeah, my apologies for jumping in. Is there any chance you can show the names on the top of the screens? Because listeners cannot see, there is a gray area we can see, and the names are hidden behind.
I'm desperately sorry, but I don't know how to change that. I can see the names on my screen.
It moved. You've done something and it moved actually a bit more to the left.
Is this, can you see the names now? Okay.
Yeah, it's there is a gray screen which is moving, and now it's under the line, so this should be fine. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. So the majority of these plants were almost completely overgrown with lichens, so it is not possible to appreciate one character of Pelargonium Cortusifolium, which makes it really different to Pelargonium crassicaule, and that's the shape of the stems. In this particular photograph, we should be able to see that the stems are covered with wart-like remains of stipules. Pelargonium crassicaule has paper-like or thin stipules that fall off, whereas Pelargonium cortusifolium develops warts at the base of old stipules, and those warts remain on the surface of the stems. And this is a particular character that separates the two species. The flowers are very similar of cortusifolium and crassicaule. The nectar tube length is very similar as well, or the hypanthium length is very similar as well. So it's actually quite interesting what separates the two species in terms of their pollination vectors, in terms of the insects that pollinate the two species. It's evident that the insects can tell the two species apart, but what it is that the insects, what character it is on the basis of which insects know which one of these is cortusifolium and which plant is crassicaule is entirely unclear to me. Other Geraniaceae that are particularly common on the peninsula are sarcocaulons, or Munsonias, if you like, Munsonia section sarcocaulon. And this is a particularly beautiful, to my mind at least, specimen of Sarcocaulon patersoni. Typically with its typical pink flowers, pink petals, and in this particular case, covered with lichens as well. Sarcocaulon patersoni is a very widely distributed sarcocaulon. It can be found along the coast in the diamond mining area, as well as in the coastal Richtersveld. But it can also be found a little bit further inland towards Aus and Rosh Pina in southern Namibia. And there are another species was described that has slightly magenta, more deeply colored petals called Sarcocaulon lavrani. And different schools exist that believe that is an actual species. And some people believe it may not be, because it's really just the shade of petals that's slightly different and the length of spines that remain on older plants. What's absolutely amazing about Munsonia patersoni, or Sarcocaulon patersoni, growing on the peninsula itself, is that it grows almost horizontally. This is because of the frequent high winds on the peninsula that are not only strong, but also carry a lot of sand with them. So a lot of the stems that otherwise in other areas have lots of spines remaining are sanded almost to the level of being almost smooth. So these stems are not just horizontal, but almost smoother, but much smoother than in other areas where Sarcocaulon patersoni is found. This is an absolutely stunning specimen, to say. Another species that with Andre we looked for many times, but saw for the first time on the Luderitz Peninsula is the truly exceptional Pelargonium Septorfifolium. If you look closely, you will see an entire group of plants on this particular slide. And these are small plantlets that grow entirely horizontal, that show no stem above ground, and only really just show the leaves or the laminas on the surface of the soil, on the surface of sand. And it is really quite interesting that through through a system of underground tubers. These plants may well be connected to each other, and it's entirely possible that this group of plants is really just one plant with several interconnected tubers and with several growth tips. It's also entirely possible those tubers extend for much further apart. We would really need to uncover these plants to see how connected they are to each other. These are almost impossible to find, even if you're standing on top of them, because their color is very, very gray-green because of the hairy leaves. So very often they are very difficult to find, except, of course, when they are in flower. The flowers are the typical Cortusina flowers with two slightly differently shaped posterior petals, very nicely marked, and actually quite big, considering how small the rest of the plants are. There's one specimen, another specimen. You can see how difficult the leaves are, how difficult it is to spot the leaves, but how easy it is to spot the plants if they are in flower, of course. They grow entirely exposed to the sun and to the elements, so which is why they grow in such a compact form. If these are grown in the greenhouse or elsewhere in less adverse conditions, you might actually see a bit of stem developing above ground. I've grown these from seed, and I use a substrate that is almost entirely aggregate, fine sand, and I use almost no organic matter except in the layer where I planted the tubers, and I almost always water them from below in order for the tubers to survive and in order for the leaves to die off in the dormant period. I find that these plants require a period of dormancy to flower, and I also find that they require particularly high sunlight levels or high levels of light in order to flower well and in order to develop fertile stamens. Unfortunately, because I cannot provide that in my greenhouse, I haven't yet been able to produce seed in the greenhouse, which really infuriates me. But fingers crossed for next January, February, when the first flowers appear on these absolutely stunning pelargoniums. Another photograph just to compare the size of these pelargoniums to the typical mesemp plants that can be found all across the peninsula. This is not the only plant that has developed this type of lifestyle in the peninsula or indeed in the coastal Namib desert. There are other Geraniaceae that have developed exactly the same shape and look really, really very similar. For example, Munsonia ignorata, which again has very small tubers buried deep in the sand, about 20-30 centimeters. It develops really quite beautiful rosettes of leaves at the surface of the sand. And unlike Pelargonium Septorfifolium, develops very small white or green-white flowers that really aren't very showy compared to other Munsonias. What's beautiful about Munsonia ignorata is that its leaves are look pleated. They have a very nice structure, and I believe it would be really quite beautiful to try and grow this in a collection. But unfortunately, I've never been able to find any plants in flower or indeed to collect seeds. But it's interesting that the same growth form has developed twice in two genera of the same family. In order to make this presentation slightly more dynamic, I've included a video here so that you get an idea of what exploring plants in this particular region looks like. So this is, you've seen that we're maybe 50 meters away from the ocean, and it's because this is a natural park, it's entirely possible to walk around, obviously taking care not to step on any Pelargonium Septorfifolium if you were able to see it. To see them, we see some Pelargonium Classical here, growing quite nicely, quite healthy. There's lots and lots of these, and of course, lots of Sarcocaulon Pattersoni as well, a particularly large shrub here. A few more Sarcocaulons. An almost dead carcass of Pelargonium Classical, another healthy plant. Although this looks like a desert, it really isn't. There's a lot of Geraniaceae growing here, a lot of mesons, a lot of conophytums, even lithops plants. So it's an absolute heaven to visit for anyone interested in xerophytic plants. Another, or rather two Pelargonium Classical, slightly smaller ones. And here's Andre, who, as is always the case, finds the most interesting plants. And he's pointing to a small colony of Pelargonium Septorfifolium, which isn't possible to see unless you get down on your knees and look at the plants from up close. Few more there, and this is really what the plants look like in real life. They really don't get much bigger than this. In northern South Africa, in the coastal Richtersveld, they get a little bit bigger. As I already mentioned, they sometimes develop stems above ground as well. But the leaves are usually this size, so about 1 to 2 centimeters across. And on the Luderitz Peninsula, they are slightly less hairy than they are in the coastal Richtersveld. Okay. So moving on, we now travel towards the north of Luderitz. This is an area that is perhaps slightly different in climate, but it's also an area that has that we will visit slightly further inland. So not just the coastal area, but maybe about 2-3 kilometers inland. And this is where Pelargonium Classical grows with slightly thinner stems, but not quite the thinness that we are used to when we consider Pelargonium Mirandas. I think this is still Pelargonium Classical proper, and we see that this was a particularly intensely flowering specimen, and a couple of years ago I was able to collect a few seeds from these plants that are now being grown by some of the members of the International Geraniaceae group, with the particular intention to see whether they develop tubers or not. But these stems are already thinner, and these plants are already much more densely branched than on the Luderitz Peninsula proper. It's also probable that these plants are slightly more sheltered, so they don't experience the same strong winds as the plants on the peninsula itself, because the area around Luderitz is particularly flat, just south of the town, and slightly more hilly north of the town. The area gets a little bit more hilly towards inland. We're now about 40 kilometers inland from Luderitz, and this is what the southern Namib looks like. The desert itself, very little vegetation, very few shrubs. We'll see later some of this flat land is particularly densely populated by sarcocaulons, but the vegetation really only persists on these Inselbergs. These mountains, or small hills really, are extremely densely populated with succulents, very difficult to get to, as I already mentioned, lots of aloes as well, and an awful lot of Geraniaceae. The small Pelargonium albersi, which I mentioned previously, I only found a single plant growing here, and these are the thin-stemmed Pelargonium albersi, very similar to Pelargonium Serotophilum, but these are the sister species, as I mentioned before, with tubers, hiding tubers underground, of course. It's really interesting that Pelargonium albersi and Pelargonium Serotophilum grow so close to each other. And according to Becker, they sometimes hybridize, but I haven't found any hybrid specimens, although I've seen many populations of both species. This is a typical flower of Pelargonium albersi, a typical Otidia flower, posterior petals with ears, as you can see. And as I mentioned earlier, they have an intensely citrusy smell as well. This is, of course, a flowering specimen in my greenhouse. What's also absolutely stunning is that these Inselbergs are the southwestern border of the distribution area of Munsonia crassicaulis, or Sarcocaulon crassicaule. I was gobsmacked to find them here. I totally didn't expect Sarcocaulon crassicaule to grow on these island mountains, but here they are. And they seem to do particularly well with lots of flowering specimens as well. It doesn't stretch any further north, Sarcocaulon crassicaule or Munsonia crassicaulis. This is predominantly a winter rainfall plant. And although several sarcocaulons can be found in the central Namib, for example, Marlotti, Mossamedense, and a couple of years ago, we found specimens of Salmoniflorum as well. Munsonia crassicaulis, its distribution ends here. A really, really interesting plant, Pelargonium Grandi Calcaratum, growing on these bergs as well. These are super miniature plants, mostly about 20 centimeters tall. Some of you may be growing these plants, these taxa, these species, and will know that they typically grow to half a meter tall. We've seen very large specimens in the central Richtersveld, 1.5 meters tall, and pretty sizable shrubs as well. These are small, but not because they'd be grazed. These are small because of the adverse conditions in the southwestern Namib. I was absolutely pleased to see a flowering specimen here as well. A couple of years ago, well, not a couple, but probably 30 years ago now, when the Czech botanist Halda visited the area, he described these specimens as a new species. I think he named it Pelargonium yarmilai, but it later turned out that that was, of course, synonymous with Pelargonium Calcaratum. This is the same species from the central Richtersveld, and you see that it usually develops into particularly sizable bushes, into very large shrubs. So what we've seen in the southwestern Namib was really quite exceptional. The taxa, or the species that we usually want to see on these Inselbergs, is of course Pelargonium Mirandas. I've mentioned before that I don't really see this species as extremely different to Pelargonium crassicaule, although of course on these mountains it develops into particularly beautiful shrubs. That's because it repeatedly branches and forms, I think there's even a word for it, coralliform shrubs. These are very, very easy to admire if the plants are dormant, so leafless, or when the plants are dead. And here is a dead specimen that shows that absolutely stunning shape that it develops on these mountains. But because we visited this area in 2018, and this was the 6th consecutive year of no rainfall at all, a lot of the population of this species was already dead in this particular habitat, on this particular mountain that we visited. I'd estimate that somewhere between 50% to 80% of the entire population was already dead because of the prolonged drought. However, some of these in sheltered conditions grew nicely and flowered nicely as well. This is a particularly beautiful large specimen growing in a crack in shelter position, so it must have retained a little bit more humidity. Flowers very nicely, very similar, if not identical flowers to Pelargonium crassicaule. Slightly smaller leaves, but I think that cultivation experiments need to be done in order to appreciate these vegetative differences between Pelargonium mirandas and Pelargonium crassicaule. The taxon that I've been looking for many times and always eluded me was Pelargonium anauris. This is another Otidia type plant that is, for all intents and purposes, extremely similar to Pelargonium crypnifolium. But what's interesting is that Pelargonium crypnifolium, according to Matthias Becker, who described this species for the first time, what's really interesting is that Pelargonium crypnifolium extends all across the Western Cape, almost up to the northern Namaqualand, southern Richtersveld. Then Pelargonium paniculatum takes over, which is the sister species of Pelargonium crypnifolium. And then when Pelargonium paniculatum no longer thrives, somewhere between Aus and Roshpinach in southern Namibia, Pelargonium crypnifolium takes over again. And some of these shrubs are very special in that their posterior petals, allegedly, at least according to Becker, do not develop ears, and therefore the name anauris, or without ears on posterior petals. These shrubs are sizable. They can be up to 0.5 meter, 60 centimeters tall, and they typically grow on south-facing slopes. Some of them are obviously a little bit smaller, but you can see that the shape of these shrubs is very reminiscent of Pelargonium crypnifolium. This was a particularly large shrub overlooking the Namib Desert. You can see the absence of any vegetation down there, but the stony hillsides are quite full of plant life. This, however, is Pelargonium Cortusifolium from close to the Dorns in the Western Cape, so maybe 50 kilometers east of Worcester. And these plants are extremely tall, extremely big, lots of rainfall here, can get as tall as a meter, 120 centimeters. But to my mind, this is basically the same species. When I looked at the structure of flowers of the two species, I think there is a slide. Yep. You can see that while Pelargonium anauris flowers are a little bit smaller compared to the flowers of Pelargonium cortusifolium, they flower at the same time. And although the publication describing Pelargonium anauris claims that it doesn't have any ears, that the posterior petals have no ears, we can see small ears on the posterior petals of Pelargonium anauris. So I think we should safely conclude that the two species are in fact the same. The stem shape, the shape of the inflorescences is exactly the same. They flower at the same time. It just so happens that we have two disjunct populations in the Western Cape, Northern Cape, and another population in southern Namibia that are slightly different. And it's no surprise that the plants in southern Namibia are smaller. There are other plants of which shapes we can compare in southern Namibia and northern South Africa. For example, Munsonia pattersoni or Sarcocaulon pattersoni develops very different shapes that we've seen on the Luderitz Peninsula compared to those growing in sheltered positions in the coastal Richtersveld. This is the same species, but developing extremely different shapes in slightly more favorable conditions in the coastal Richtersveld. That's a gross understatement that these are slightly more favorable. These conditions in the coastal Richtersveld are still extremely adverse, very little rainfall, but just slightly more shelter and slightly more fog in order to enable these plants to grow into the shrubs that they are. Whereas the shrubs growing on the Luderitz Peninsula, as I already mentioned, are horizontal, have to endure extremely high winds, wind-borne sand, and extremely little rainfall, hence the different shape. Just to conclude the story of Pelargonium Classical and Pelargonium Mirandas, we've seen various different shapes as we traveled from the Luderitz Peninsula towards north of Luderitz and then inland. We've seen very thick stems of Pelargonium Classical, slightly thinner stems just north of Luderitz, and very thin and repeatedly branched stems inland from Luderitz. This is a flowering plant just east of Alexander Bay, so coastal Richtersveld, and we see that it has the repeatedly branched pattern, but the stems are slightly thicker than the typical Pelargonium Mirandas growing east of Luderitz. So I would consider this almost a continuum of shape and stem thicknesses, from the extremely thick stems on the Luderitz Peninsula to the very thin and repeatedly branched stems of Pelargonium Mirandas just inland from Luderitz, with all types of shapes and stem thicknesses in between, depending on how sheltered conditions the plants grow in. And to conclude, I think there's another short video of our exploration just on one of those Inselbergs east of Luderitz. You see that there's quite a few shrubs here. This is another Munsonia crassicaulis. Lots of other plants, almost in total absence of plant life on the dunes, and a beautiful shrub half-dead shrub of Pelargonium Mirandas. Another one of those. One that's unfortunately dead already. And the big shrub of Pelargonium anauris that we've seen before in one of the slides. Slightly smaller inflorescences than on Pelargonium Cortusifolium that we usually see in Western Cape and Northern Cape, but undoubtedly the same shape as Cortusifolium. And the view that these plants have is absolutely stunning as well. Down on the dunes, there's very little plant life, but not total absence of it. We see a fairly thick colony of Sarcocaulon pattersoni growing just next to the road. So it's impossible to miss these plants if you're driving towards Luderitz. And there's really just one road that takes you to the town. Again, we see quite a few dead plants along the road. And of course, quite a few really healthy plants. But because this was not a national park area and because this was literally on the road, we took one of these carcasses to test the what we're often told in Geraniaceae literature, that these plants were used to light up fires by bushmen, because obviously the bark is made of a thick layer of wax. And of course, the test succeeded. We were able to use a dead plant of a Monsonia pattersoni to light up our evening braai. We opened a bottle of absolutely delicious South African red wine and enjoyed our evening. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this talk.